And the those that join later, they can always go back and review the recorded session. So let's start. Um, Welcome to a CFA webinar. We are going to be talking about coral reef finance today, and my name is David Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, and this webinar is being presented in collaboration with the Wildlife Conservation Society and 50 Reefs. And it's going to be a lot of information, and we hope to go through it relatively quickly. The idea is to create enough time at the end for questions, and there's also an accompanying document, a paper that you can download from the CFA website that will have more information on the topic. So we look forward to you reading that, and any comments, questions you may have afterwards. You can always contact us later. So let me start off with just a few points about the webinar. Everyone has their own controls of microphones, so if you don't mind, if you can shut your microphones off, mute yourself during the course of the presentation. That would increase the quality of the sound for everyone. And if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you feel free to write them into the chat box. You can direct them only at the organizers if you'd like, or you can send them to everyone. We will be going through those questions afterwards and either reading them out or allowing you to unmute yourself and ask the questions directly to the presenters, so that we can have a nice lively discussion and question and answer period. Now let me start real quickly with an overview of a little bit about the Conservation Finance Alliance before we start. The CFA has been around since 2002. It is the leading global professional alliance of conservation finance experts and practitioners working on a global level. There's a membership of over 600 people from around the world. These are some leading experts and practitioners, quite a range of experience with conservation finance. And we have 3 active working groups that are doing a range of projects. There's a working group on environmental funds, one on protected area finance, and one on innovation. The innovation working group is focused on launching the CFA incubator. And we have a whole range of other projects and knowledge products that we're working on that have been going on for some time, including the Conservation Trust Investment Survey, which Katie and Ray lead, and the Practice Standards for Conservation Trust Funds, which is in the process of being updated, as well as the Conservation Finance Guide, which we've released the legacy version, put that back online recently at conservationfinance.info. So more information can be found at the Conservation Finance Alliance website listed below. And with that, I'll get right to the webinar and pass the microphone over to Katie Mathias, who will start us off. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see a great turnout on this. So the co-authors of this paper, Venkat, David, Ray, and I will be the presenters today. I want to recognize Melissa Walsh from Pacific Ocean Finance, who is not joining us on today's the first webinar because it's the middle of the night where she is, but she'll be on the second webinar for the Asian Pacific time zones later today. We could have the next slide, please. So our objectives and goals for today, I'm going to provide some introduction and context to the paper and the webinar. David will talk about business planning and the important role that it plays in developing finance solutions. Venkat will give an overview of the finance tools that we highlighted in the paper. We'll provide some more deep select examples, and then Ray will pull together the conclusions. So this webinar, as I think everyone knows, is in support of a paper that we just put out called Finance Tools for Coral Reef Conservation. It's a guide. It was developed, intended to highlight the financial tools that are being used or could be used for reef conservation, developed as a resource for protected area managers and the other folks who are charged with achieving conservation and protection of coral reefs. Vertico Lab in 2018 released a paper called Innovations for Coral Finance, and this guide very much builds on their work. So we want to recognize it as, if you haven't read that yet, we encourage you to read that as well. You can find the paper online at cfalliance.org, the Conservation Finance Alliance website, and you just go to resources and click on CFA publications. It's right there. The next slide. So I think for everyone, certainly if you've come onto this website, you're well aware of the threats to coral reefs, and we don't need to go into those. A very high sensitivity to climate change, ocean acidification. We're risking significant damage to coral reefs over the next several decades if something isn't done. The International Coral Reef Initiative has categorized the main conservation activities that are in support of coral reef conservation: the creation, development, and management of marine protected areas, sustainable fisheries, the restoration of coral ecosystems, the suppression of the external pressure factors that are threatening the reefs, and the development and encouragement of sustainable tourism. And so as we approached the use of finance guides, financial tools, we looked at them in terms of how they support those 5 conservation activities. And in addition, while we know there are critical biodiversity conservation outcomes from preserving reefs, there's also been a lot of work in recognizing the economic and financial benefits as well. The United Nations Environmental Program recently released a report that indicated that just looking at 2 specific areas, Indonesia and Mesoamerica, the financial benefits of restoring reefs and protecting them could unlock an additional $37 billion in Indonesia, $35 billion in Mesoamerica, compared to the status quo of letting reefs decline without intervention. So as we think about the work of coral reef conservationists, these challenges are well known, that there's insufficient funding available now. There are an array of financing tools which may seem overwhelming to protected area managers or other ones charged with coral reef conservation. Organizations, MPA managers, and NGOs are facing capacity limitations, often with small staff who may not have familiarity with some of the available financial tools. And there's a need for a process or framework to help evaluate the funding options that are out there. So the purpose of this guide was to serve as a resource. We identify in it the important critical role of business planning and lay out some tools and process for doing that. We dive into 13 finance tools and provide an overview of them. You see them there on the right of the slide. We do some case studies and analysis to show how financial tools are working in real life, and offer a comparative framework for helping to decide which tools it's worth pursuing within a specific context or for a specific reef. It is intended to provide an introduction and overview. It is not an implementation guide. So certainly there are more detailed next steps once a protected area or a group has determined which financial tools to pursue, then additional resources will be needed on how to go forward. And hopefully reaching out to some of the case studies might provide some help with next steps as well. So I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the important role of business planning.
Thank you, Katie. And that's a great introduction to the paper. So with regard to business planning, and business planning is an activity, a planning activity that's done for a range of different reasons. First, let's see, what is a business plan? It's a written document that's developed through consultation and analysis. It summarizes the plan to achieve objectives, and it describes how you're going to achieve those objectives through management and through finance. Business plans are useful, obviously, for businesses, but they could be written for a protected area. This is quite common. NGOs do them, community organizations, conservation trust funds can use them, and obviously for-profit or cooperative businesses. They should be written in a language and style that potential investors and donors respect and understand, and motivate those investors and donors towards contributing financially or through partnerships to the organization. It's really important to use a correct process in business planning, the goal here is to make sure that your stakeholders are involved, so that when the plan is complete, you can support revenue generation, fundraising, through identifying very detailed funding needs, justifying those needs, where your sources of financing come from, your donors and investors, what finance mechanisms and tools you will be using to achieve your goals, and highlighting the return on investment or the economic benefits of conservation. They can also help improve the organization's management and effectiveness by helping managers think through different steps that are required to achieve their mission or their stated outcomes, by establishing a realistic budget and execution plan, and looking at different scenarios and feasibility assessments, and especially cost effectiveness. Sometimes organizations just implement activities because that's what they're used to. It's important to take a step back and look at are these the most cost effective and appropriate activities. They also can help the organization understand their strengths and weaknesses, and to better leverage those strengths and minimize the impacts or fix those weaknesses in the organization. How they fit into business, protected area management plans and things like that, specifically for protected areas here, is they're kind of a subset of the management plan. So they fit within the overarching management plan, which would include more science-based information. And then within the business plan, there's also a financial plan that speaks very specifically to the financial aspects of the organization. Now, the process to implement a business plan is as important as the result, as I mentioned, to try to engage both internal and external stakeholders, so that when the business plan comes out, you have the buy-in and the engagement of your key actors. So you begin with the visioning process. What are your aspirations? What's your mission? What do you seek to achieve? You want to build up your cost estimates from the bottom up by asking, what do we need to do to achieve the specific outcome? The plan should be realistic yet ambitious. It should strive to achieve your mission and your outcomes, or at least what you can achieve in the time frame of the plan. You should use SMART indicators wherever you can, defined as specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And the plan should be considered a living document, something that is not just fixed in stone, but something that you can adapt as conditions change. Here is a standard business plan outline that we like to promote. So you can see, starting, of course, with an executive summary, going through the background that includes both the vision, mission, as well as a physical and biological description of the site, for example, that you're working on. Then you go through operations and management, including organizational structure, the plan, looking at risk analysis, how you're measuring and evaluating your outcomes. Then you do a strategic analysis, looking at what your priorities are, what's your value proposition, how's your competitive positioning, what is the sort of institutional gap analysis, where is capacity to be developed, then your implementation plan, and perhaps a cost-benefit analysis on that plan. And additionally, in many cases, you would want to do a marketing plan, looking at your stakeholders, your messaging, communications, and of course, fundraising. And then a financial plan where you look at what your historical spending has been, what your projections are for your future financial needs, and how you're seeking to achieve sustainable financing. And when you're looking at approaches to achieve increased income, we like to think of different ways of looking at it. First, in the bottom left, you want to look at existing mechanisms and sources. These are the easiest finance solutions to implement. They already exist. Can you scale them? New sources within those existing mechanisms are as a second place. Are there other donors that are interested? The bottom right are new mechanisms. What opportunities can you use given your capacity? And then the top right is often more challenging, where you have both a new source and a new mechanism. So it's important to think of all different sources as you go. And now I'm going to pass over to Venkat to give you an overview of the finance tools that the paper covers.
Thank you, David. So just as a quick recap, it's important, as David mentioned, to get through your business plan and understand your sources of revenues, your sources of costs, and identify feasibility for the new options, as we'll quickly discuss here. So as a quick overview, obviously it was hard for us to go through every single one of these in detail given the time of the webinar. So what we wanted to do was to give everyone listening a quick sentence description or two of the mechanism that we discussed in the report and the case study that we highlighted. And these case studies and these mechanisms were assessed in the report due to lots of different factors: revenue potential, conservation priorities being addressed, as Katie mentioned, and the ease of implementation. And certainly you can take this with a pinch of salt, but at least what we're going to do in the next few slides is kind of bucket the different mechanisms in terms of ease of implementation. Donors and entrance and access fees, etc., are probably easier to get money from than something like biodiversity offsets or deaf nature swaps. So without further ado, next slide, please, David. We can talk about the slightly easier ones that we highlighted in the paper. First thing, donations and philanthropy. As a quick kind of note, between 2010 and 2016, this was highlighted by the ICRI report. There was $1.9 billion being given to coral reef funding, about $250 billion per year. By the graph you can see here, the majority of it comes from multilateral agencies and foundations. Direct government expenditure, this had to be mentioned, it's not a lot. In developing countries, it's about 0.2% of gross domestic product per year. And certainly these two avenues of funding are critical for any reef conservation and always must be thought of before you start thinking of the slightly more complicated sustainable financing mechanisms. So entrance and access fees for protected areas, they're charged directly to users and tourists of a protected area, and fees vary across the world. Typically charged when a visitor wants to come in. Special use permits are similar in some ways. These are for activities that provide a benefit to an individual or group or organization getting access to a protected area resources, in this case coral reefs. In contrast to protected entrance fees, there's conditionality attached to special use permits. So it's particularly also one-time use for an activity like diving or filming, etc. And for a quick example, we highlighted in the paper, Tanzania marine protected areas or marine parks charge about $24 per tourist coming in, but for special use permits, they vary. For example, if you want to film in the area, it's about $1,000 per week. Concessions can be loosely defined as a lease, license, easement, or permit, or an operation undertaken by any party other than the protected area operator themselves. So we highlighted the Hawaii case where boat stands and food services, etc., on the beaches pay about $10,000 a month to the Park Service. And now, in terms of the more medium ease of implementation options, we highlighted bonds, and nature bonds are financial instruments issued by corporations and government agencies or even international organizations looking to borrow money from investors for projects that clearly and objectively rely on conservation outcomes. And we highlighted the Seychelles Blue Bond. This was a $15 million debt issue relying on fisheries investments. Markets and impact investing, the Blue Finance example in the Caribbean, Blue Finance is a nonprofit working to create public-private partnerships. The graphic showing here, they create these PPPs at the site level, creating an independent entity at the ground level, collecting funds, and an impact capital investor can put in money to manage the site. And this relies heavily on tourism, but it's a nice revenue generating mechanism on the ground. Conservation trust funds, I suspect a lot of people are familiar with this listening in. They're private, legally independent, non-government institutions that rely on either endowments or sinking funds to fund conservation. And we focused on the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and also the Mesoamerican Reef Fund in the Caribbean. Taxes and levies. So these are specifically targeting environmental conservation related activities. You could target tourists, businesses, fisherfolk, coastal residents, imposed by the government at the national or state level. We highlighted the Maldives green tax. This is, from my what I recall, $6 per tourist at the site level in the Maldives. And finally, the tougher kind of ease of implementation tools that we highlighted in the report. David, if you could quickly move on to the last slide. Thank you. So biodiversity offsets. So these are widely used regulatory instruments assigning financial liability of environmental damage to project developers. And we use the Great Barrier Reef as an example, and David will actually cover that example in more detail in the upcoming slides. Payment for ecosystem services, relying on users of ecosystem services providing the stewards of that service a payment. And there are lots of different ways, and certainly a lot of different mechanisms have a PES component. We highlighted the Quintana Roo reef insurance scheme in Mexico, created by the Nature Conservancy and involving the risk company Swiss Re. And it's a highly detailed case study, and if you're interested in this, I highly encourage you to read it. It's about a $15 or $20 million payout from Swiss Re to local tourist operators in the case of a hurricane or storm damage. Impact bonds. So this is slightly different than the other bonds in terms of the impact bonds relying on third-party investors to provide risk, to take on the risk of project innovation to drive public policy outcomes. So in other words, the government pays for the program when outcomes are achieved. We highlighted the case of the DC water, but there was a water utility and Goldman Sachs was involved as providing capital as well. And certainly impact bonds could be used in the future / resilience bonds for funding wetlands and reefs near areas with significant damage and population. Debt for nature swaps. So this was more complicated transaction where the sovereign debt of a country is forgiven or partially forgiven by debtors in exchange for commitments to biodiversity conservation. And we highlighted the Seychelles debt for nature swap, which funded the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan. Again, TNC was involved in this scheme as well. And in insurance schemes, mentioned this earlier, this is part of PES. And you're welcome to go ahead and read that further in the report. And finally, conservation enterprise incubators. And an incubator or accelerator is a program that provides technical assistance or grants / debt equity financing to fledgling commercial enterprises. And a bunch of different NGOs, nonprofits, or even venture capitalists have these incubators inside, and you can either focus on the debt or equity finance. We focused a little bit on the Conservation International day-to-day ventures, focusing on debt finance. So that was very quick, but at least that was the broad overview of the bunch of mechanisms that we focused on the report. And once again, these were highlighted in detail regarding their potential ability and feasibility on the ground, and regarding how much money and revenue potentially you can make with the cases that we presented. And to deep dive a little bit into these, I'll hand it over to David to talk a little bit more about impact investing.
Okay, thank you, Venkat. Yes, as you can see, there's quite a lot of activity and opportunity out there. Specifically for impact investing, this is an area that is growing in interest, and a lot of actors in this space think that this is a great way to get more private money into conservation and into coral reefs. Impact investments are investments that are made into companies, organizations, and funds with the intention to generate social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. And there's been quite a range of types of investments going in. One of which is of bonds. That there was a blue bond that was offered in Seychelles, which is a type of impact investing. The idea is that a lot of these are blended finance tools where, in the case of the bond, for example, you have a multilateral institution that provides a credit enhancement. It takes some of the risk away, and then you have private or public investors that provide capital to the bond issuer, and then the bond issuer then uses that money for specific activities. In the case here, could be sustainable fishery activities, private marine protected areas, There's a lot of interest in work on reducing plastics in the ocean, and there's some technologies that can be developed there, or they're being developed there, as well as, of course, climate-related investments. The idea of a private bond is that revenue is generated, the money goes back through the bond issuer to the investors, and this is one type of impact investing. Other types of impact investing could be direct investments in equity in companies, debt in companies, and there's quite a few groups out there trying to work in the space. I'm going to pass it over to Ray now, who's going to just talk briefly about marine biodiversity offsets. And Ray, over to you.
Great, thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, my throat's a little scratchy from a bit of a cold. But we talked in the paper also about the potential to generate some resources that would come from trying to, how would I say, best to manage impacts from development, to require that companies who are going to have an impact on the marine environment, on reefs, compensate for that impact but first going through the mitigation approach to try to avoid those impacts and limit those. And in the paper, we talk about some work that's been done in the Great Barrier Reef, along with the Great Barrier Trust, where funds are paid into this trust by companies who need to compensate for their impacts. And there is development that's going on in and around the reef in Australia. It's not all protected. And so what they've done basically is come up with a mechanism where they've, and we have a chart in the paper which shows they've come up with the restoration costs, come up some various factors that they use to indicate, well, if you're going to restore a certain number of hectares of some kind of seagrass, or if you're going to work in mangroves or something, then there's going to be a cost to that, and those costs could be quite substantial, depending, like a unit cost may be $8,000 or $9,000, and depends on the unit. So having these amounts already indicated, I think is also could be a good incentive for people to say, well, we really need to minimize the level of impacts that we're having, because it would make the project certainly more costly, the greater area that one would have to compensate for. And basically, Australia is an example where there is a requirement to have an offset in place. So we listed it as like offsets as one of the more complicated programs, because it does really require a lot of work with government to put in place the appropriate regulations and requirements that would both establish the need to put in place offsets, but also the financial mechanisms, especially those financial mechanisms where to get a license, people need to pay upfront. Because as you can see from these different lists that are on the slide, there's a temporal strategy and the financial liability, and we'd really want to get money up front to be able to have available for the implementation of the offset. If it's not done ahead of time, then at least it's part of the process early on, even before the impacts occur. That would be the ideal situation. And in fact, in some of the countries where we're working now, we're exploring specifically those types of arrangements with governments around the world to put in place policies that would require offsets. Melissa, who is unable to be on the call, estimates that there's going to be from offsets from up to around $85 million flowing into the Great Barrier Reef because of the need to compensate. So it's a strategy. it can work. It could generate significant resources for conservation, but it's a process. It's a process of ensuring that there's good practice. It's a process of ensuring that you can develop the legislation and the regulatory environment, and to implement that effectively. So it does take time, but it's probably good development policy as first, and then there is a financial benefit from adopting that good policy. So you can read a bit more of that in the paper, and I think it's an area that we'll see more focus on as development picks up pace around the world. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So we wanted to, have, as I said, finish up and leave some time for some questions or comments, which we'll appreciate. People have had a chance to read this and give some comments, but basically our conclusions are focused on the idea of how we prioritize our options and envision an optimal mix of tools, the mix of finance solutions, and then the idea of diversification. Next slide. Right. So in our looking at our prioritization, there are a lot of factors that have to go in, and David already mentioned the issues that would need to be looked at in terms of any kind of business plan, and basically, there are various issues to look at. First of all, as we've already said, there's certainly no one solution. So that, that is something that's, really, really important. So as we look at our options, we got to look at what kind of, institutional, organizational capacity exists. And that's pretty key in terms of being able to organize and do the implementation and to gain success. The feasibility, there are lots of ideas here. No one's certainly going to organize a huge project to collect tourist fees if there are no tourists. So I mean, there has to be this essential elements in the plan to be able to develop that. And there's obviously different things that happen within a site versus a system. There may be things that could work in a system, and then certain sites are subsidized based on what the system can generate. So those kind of decisions we'll need to look at. Things take time to put in place. So as I was just talking about in terms of biodiversity offsets, certainly there's a lot of investment in the process of building up the mechanism and the framework to create the offset, but the financial impact may be very, very positive. But so to looking at the positive impact on that. Compatibility mission, environmental social impact, economic model, is this the right thing to do based on what the organization is trying to achieve? And then we have to look at the return on investment. There are a lot of costs and there are risks, and then how do we take those all into account and make the most appropriate decision regarding the mechanism we want to apply. Next slide. And, there are lots of ways to generate money. And so what is the appropriate mix to get to where we want to do? Where's that money going to go and how's it going to be generated? How do we use donor funds, for example, to leverage additional funding? We've talked about impact investing, but sometimes we may need to have donor funds available first to create the foundation to provide some guarantees. So it's about a mix of tools. It's not a particular tool. And as a system matures, that mix of tools, or the number of tools that could be applied, may actually increase as new conditions are created, and as new demand by funders for specific activities increases. And so, and as new international agreements create opportunities, as we work in this kind of approach, much of many of the type of mechanisms that we look at could be generated by policy, and where we can create new markets. That's the case in carbon markets, like some there are PES, other PES. So we need to look at those kinds of opportunities and have a short-term, vision in terms of what we need today, and then figuring out how we leverage all that for some kind of long-term outcome. Next slide. So, and then there's a mix of finance solutions. So, can we address these financial needs that we've identified with the finance, or part of it, or what's our strategy, what's our goal, our risk. We want to have a diverse set of solutions so that we don't rely on only one source of funding, and that if it disappears, we'd be in a problem. It may be really smart to have a strong tourism revenue collection scheme, but recognizing that the next terrorist attack or some disease or what happened that results in people not traveling could put a dent in that, and to plan for that appropriately. And then, as I said, we have this idea of our planning and sequencing, in terms of what priorities we address first and how we do that. And as I said already, this mix of short and long-term solutions, and then how we integrate our conservation solutions and how they become integrated with sustainable development. I was earlier talking about biodiversity offsets, and people often think, well, our biodiversity offset is going to be the creation of a new protected area or expansion of a new protected area. And well, maybe, but maybe it will be changing land use in a place managed by communities or managed by individual landowners, or investing in some kind of fisheries program that will reduce pressures on the resource. So it's not necessarily just a conservation area investment, but it's also an economic investment in how to use those funds to achieve that. Next slide. And again, I mentioned these already, but this idea, I think it's really important to keep in mind, the idea of diversification. Over-reliance on a single stream of funding is risky, and that's been seen over and over again. So I think we need to, look into our toolkit and figure out what are the many options that we can use, and also some of the funds may be used for certain things and not others. Because individual mechanisms are not often sufficient, and what can we generate? What can we use? How do we use the funds we have, and then use them to create other things? And then and how do we mix these up in a certain way so that they work together in concert to generate and leverage other funds? So I think those are I think some of our conclusions. One of the things that, this is sort of a bit of a guide, but, for those of you who don't know, the Conservation Finance Alliance years ago, 2003, prior to the Durban World Parks Congress, developed a really dynamic, very thorough assessment of different conservation finance mechanisms and solutions. Like 500 pages or something. It was really detailed. It was on the web, and one of our goals is to try to we're raising money now to try to redo that and update it to make it something available on the web and accessible, so these kinds of mechanisms and others can be available to many people. So that's a big goal for us. And I think with that, I've finished the conclusions, and we've actually managed to leave some time for questions. So thank you very much.
Seem to have trouble unmuting myself. Okay, thanks everyone for the presentation, and thank you everyone for being here. We're going to try to move to questions now, and I see that there's been quite a number of questions put into the chat. So I'm going to go up to the top, but while I go through that, if anyone and Jeannie, help me out here. If anyone has a specific question they want to ask directly to the presenters, just send a text at the bottom and we'll unmute you. I've got start with a question from Wendy. What's the approximate minimal scale of investment that conservation enterprise incubators seek? Is it 10,000, more like 100,000, or 1 million scale? This is there's quite a growing area of conservation enterprise incubators out there, and the scales vary enormously from early stage around that 10,000 to larger around 100,000. There's currently nothing that I know of at the $1 million scale, but there's quite a range. You have TNC's NatureVest. They have an accelerator. There's other different sources, and there's a couple of interesting early stage accelerators in this space. A list of different type of accelerators. We've generated one along with the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation, CIPIC. They also have a list of accelerators and incubators on their website, so I recommend going there. So I've got another question from Klaus. Klaus, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, that would be great.
Sure thing. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Perfect. So thank you for this. This is an unbelievably valuable resource in terms of the breadth of financing that it covers. And that made me think, to what extent has there been any cross-pollination, or is there any planned cross-pollination with other conversations, other activities in the broader sustainable financing space, recognizing that a lot of the financing tools themselves will be very similar regardless of what the subject of the investment is. And there is so much that these different communities of practice can learn from each other, be it sustainable fisheries, be it aquaculture, but equally from terrestrial analogs in terrestrial protected areas, in soft commodity financing, in red financing, this sort of thing. Has there been much bridge building, I suppose, between those different areas? Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. I'll just take that briefly, but anyone else is willing to step in, more than welcome to. Yet there's a huge overlap between terrestrial and marine in many of these mechanisms, and some of the mechanisms that have been used on terrestrial have been shared then and expanded to marine, and vice versa. As well, there's a strong correlation with a lot of the sustainable development finance work that's going on, and the UNDP has a website up called Sustainable Development Finance Solutions. You can pretty much put that into a Google, and you'll come to a site that has around 22 different entries currently. A lot of them are relevant to nature, and they're the 5-page, very detailed introductions to a lot of these mechanisms. So there's a shared vocabulary, there's a shared approach, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization in this space. Anyone else want to add to that? Okay. Let's see, other questions. I have a question from Anne-Marie. Would you like to unmute yourself? If not, I'm happy to read the question. Is there a reason why you didn't include carbon offsets in the document? You mentioned sequestration under PES. Anne-Marie, you there? No? Okay, I can't hear you. You mentioned sequestration under PES and not under a broader title of offset mechanisms. Anyone want to take that? Ray?
I think maybe Venkat should take that one.
Venkat, okay, great.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question, Anne. And so yeah, so the document was focusing on carbon sequestration primarily for coral reefs and the resulting mangrove systems around them. But again, given the primary focus is reefs, and given that blue carbon and marine systems, the carbon emissions reductions are not covered by UNFCCC, meaning that the blue carbon credits cannot be created in regulated carbon market as of now. Being that, we definitely wanted to at least include the carbon sequestration and offsets regarding that, but we didn't go heavily into detail given there aren't that many schemes regarding it. Having said that, we did include valuation studies on mangrove sequestration and reef and seagrass sequestration in the hope that one day there will be credits being traded openly, but right now we left it at that. I hope that answers most of your question.
Thanks, Venkat. Next question is from Giacomo. Would you like to ask it? Just unmute yourself. Or if not, I'm happy to ask. How do you consider the decision? Are you there?
He says
No?
he can't
Okay.
unmute himself, so you should just.
Okay. So how do you consider the decision makers in the feasibility of the mechanism? For instance, entrance fees and concession fees could be feasible, but local politicians could not accept this kind of mechanism. So how do you integrate local stakeholders in the decision? Anyone would like to take that? Katie, perhaps?
I think that's a great point, and I think what we've tried to do is identify some of the key considerations that are related to each of the financial tools that we highlighted. So very much it's the case that moving the opinion of local stakeholders, of local decision makers, is a critical step in the process, and those are going to vary in each of the situations, or both in terms of the specific site and the political climate within that site, and by financial tools as well. So I think it's an important point, and it's part of the business planning and part of the management planning process to think about who are the key decision makers who have to be influenced.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can I just add something, David?
Please.
Yeah, I think that's it. Sort of rings to me because of last week we were in a situation where the idea of charging for fees is brand new, and the idea of government agreeing to these kinds of charges is still not well accepted, and I think it's just. It takes time. I think the idea of building coalitions of various stakeholders who have the political clout to influence organizing meetings and discussions and demonstrating the potential of what those kinds of fees and structures can actually do in terms of getting independence from donors and other sources can sometimes be very, very useful and successful. They may not be rapid. Sometimes I think it's just a question of evolution of time and kind of wearing down some of those barriers. It's like a wave against the seawall, but that's okay. But I think the idea that it can actually work, and we're seeing that in a context where politically, at least we're not accepted approaches. So it does take a little time, and I think that, as Katie said, that building that group of stakeholders and with enough political influence to begin to change attitudes can actually lead to some of those outcomes.
Great, thanks, Ray. Okay, so next question from Marcelo. Marcelo, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hey, how are you? Thanks for the presentation. More than a question, was kind of like more of a comment that we need to take into consideration property rights. For example, I was working on developing a fund in Costa Rica, the Blue Fund, as we call it, which is based or is a payment for ecosystem services for coastal and marine. ecosystems. And at least in Costa Rica, these ecosystems are property of the states, of the government. So the government would have the monopoly of selling those services. It's the only seller. And then you would have many buyers, which is kind of different of what's happening right now with forest, right? With land-based ecosystems. So, and this works as well if you're selling blue carbon. So who gets the rights of selling those blue carbon? Who gets, the money from that, and who can buy it? And so I think those questions on property rights, it's important, at least for this scheme for payment ecosystem services, as well as if you have legislation like the one that we have here in Costa Rica, where the owner is the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Very important point, and one especially pertinent for coral reefs, in that they're almost never privately owned. They're all communal property or government property, and so it's not just the actual property rights, but just even getting the right stakeholders to all agree to any kind of management option is challenging because of that the sort of ownership and governance situation. So great. Katie's reminding me that to mention that we are planning to launch a working group on marine and coastal finance at the CFA, and so if anyone's interested in being on that working group, or especially in taking a leadership role in that, please let us know. Reach out to us and talk to us at some point. Great. James, did you have a comment or a question? If you're still there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, yeah, James Spurgeon. Again, fantastic work, really, really useful. I just wondered, to what extent are you seeing and also advocating the use of environmental valuation studies to help to inform the different financing mechanisms in place? Is it something that's done pretty much all the time or occasionally, and how do you see that developing, evolving in the future?
Thanks, James. I'll take that first, but anyone can complement. So environmental valuation studies can really be essential to help identify where the values lie in the ecosystem management issues, and help identify what different finance solutions have the most economic leverage to make changes. But that's really only a first step. Where I see, and also it could, just like total economic value of an ecosystem or like a protected area, for example, can be quite confusing to policymakers, because they say, oh, it's worth a lot, but we're not making, we're just spending money on it. So where I see the economic valuation to be really essential in these finance solutions is in developing the solution itself, and trying to understand who wins and who loses and how much, and so I think they're essential to planning some more of these complex finance solutions, to really understand what the economics underlying those solutions are, and to make sure that you have a solid economic argument for putting in place that solution. So really essential in that way. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Just to follow up, and to what extent would you say you are seeing them actually being used? Are they being used most of the time?
Well, it depends on the finance solution. I think there's been an explosion of evaluation work since TEEB and all that, but I think that for the most part there's a lack of capacity to do this work, and so I'm not seeing them used a lot, and a lot of the mechanisms don't necessarily require it, but a lot of them could really use good back of the envelope analyses, at least to start with, and some of them quite could use quite detailed analyses. Anyone else want to chip in on that? for the offsets, for example, Ray. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in general, I don't think they are used a lot, to be honest. I think part of it, where the use becomes probably more effective, James, is like when looking at return on investment issues. Why is it worth making these investments and demonstrating those investments? Where valuation, especially if that information is available. I doubt people would put in the extra resources to carry out a valuation study necessarily. I think that in some of the, again, evaluation can have different sort of parameters too as we look at it. But if you look at the issue that we didn't talk tons about, but Venkat mentioned the insurance in Quintana Roo, that would necessarily require some levels of at least some evaluation of how the reef systems reduce risk, and so therefore you could then come up with your premiums and costs for the insurance scheme. So there are certain places where I think some level of evaluation will need to be applied to make certain mechanisms really work. And in other cases, I think, as David said, they may not be needed at all to be able to achieve the results. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Thanks, Ray. Good. Well, we're reaching the 10 o'clock or the hour, depending on where you are. So if there's maybe one last question that anyone has, we could take before we close up. Okay, well then I want to thank all the presenters and writers for this document, and thank all the participants for your questions and for listening and sharing. And we will let you know when the next webinar is going to happen. And thanks again on behalf of WCS and CFA and 50 Reefs. Goodbye.